Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. So today we're diving deep into one of the most action-packed Marvel movies ever made, Avengers: Age of Ultron. Released back in 2015, this film was one of the most anticipated sequels in cinema history, and honestly, it delivered on so many levels. Whether you're a die-hard Marvel fan or someone who just casually enjoys superhero films, this movie has something for everyone. We're going to break down everything: the plot, the characters, the behind-the-scenes production, the visual style, and of course, what the critics had to say about it. So, grab your popcorn, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Let's start from the very beginning. What is this movie actually about? The core premise of Avengers: Age of Ultron is essentially this. The Avengers, Earth's mightiest heroes, accidentally create a monster. And not just any monster. An artificial intelligence monster with world-ending ambitions. The team discovers a powerful Mind Stone inside Loki's scepter, and Tony Stark, being Tony Stark, decides it would be a great idea to use this technology to build a global peacekeeping program. The idea sounds fantastic on paper. Create an AI so advanced that it can protect the world without putting the Avengers in constant danger. But as we all know, when Tony Stark has an idea that sounds too good to be true, it usually is. The AI he creates, Ultron, wakes up, decides that the best way to achieve peace is to wipe out humanity. And suddenly, the Avengers have a massive problem on their hands. What makes this premise so compelling is that it flips the typical superhero formula on its head. The threat doesn't come from an outside villain or an alien invasion this time. It comes from the heroes themselves. The road to catastrophe is paved with good intentions, and that's something that makes Age of Ultron feel a lot more grounded and emotionally resonant than many other entries in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The whole concept of, what if the thing created to protect us becomes the thing that threatens us, is a classic science fiction theme, and director Joss Whedon uses it brilliantly here to explore questions about responsibility, power, and what it means to be a hero. Now, who are the main characters we're dealing with here? Well, if you've been following the MCU, you already know these faces well. But let's break it down properly. The core team is made up of Tony Stark, also known as Iron Man, played by Robert Downey Jr. Then there's Steve Rogers, Captain America, brought to life by Chris Evans. Thor, the God of Thunder, is played by Chris Hemsworth. Bruce Banner, who transforms into the Hulk, is played by Mark Ruffalo. Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow, is played by Scarlett Johansson. And Clint Barton, Hawkeye, is played by Jeremy Renner. These 6 characters form the beating heart of the Avengers team, and the film does a fantastic job of giving each of them their own moment to shine. But what makes Age of Ultron particularly interesting is that it doesn't just treat these characters as action figures who punch things and look cool. It actually digs into who they are as people, what they fear, what they hope for, and what their vulnerabilities are. The team dynamic feels authentic and lived in, like these people have genuinely been through a lot together and have complicated relationships with each other. There's tension, there's humor, there's genuine affection. It all feels real, and that's a huge part of why the movie works as well as it does. Speaking of the team, let's talk about Tony Stark and Steve Rogers specifically, because their dynamic is absolutely central to this film. Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark is, as always, magnetic on screen. The guy has been playing Iron Man since 2008, and he owns this character completely. But in Age of Ultron, we see a different side of Tony, a more vulnerable, more desperate side. His decision to create Ultron comes from a place of genuine fear. He's terrified that the Avengers won't be enough to protect the world from the threats that are coming, and that fear drives him to make a catastrophically bad decision. There's a scene early in the film where Tony has a vision, a nightmare, essentially, of the Avengers defeated, of the world in ruins, and it shakes him deeply. That moment of vulnerability is crucial because it helps us understand why he does what he does, even if we completely disagree with his choices. Chris Evans as Steve Rogers, on the other hand, represents the moral conscience of the team. Where Tony is all about technological solutions and grand plans, Steve is about doing what's right in the moment, trusting people, and believing in human potential without technological shortcuts. Their philosophical differences, which will eventually explode into full conflict in Captain America: Civil War, are already bubbling beneath the surface here. There's that iconic moment where Steve almost manages to lift Thor's hammer, and the look on Thor's face is absolutely priceless, by the way. And it speaks to something essential about Steve's character. He's worthy. He's the moral center. And his clash with Tony throughout Age of Ultron gives the film a lot of its dramatic tension. Now, one of the most interesting additions to this film is the character of Vision, played by Paul Bettany. If you remember, Paul Bettany had been the voice of Jarvis, Tony's AI assistant, throughout the entire MCU up to this point. So when Vision emerges, essentially born from the combination of Jarvis, Ultron's body, the Mind Stone, and Tony's programming, it's a profound moment. Vision is something entirely new. Not quite human, not quite machine, but something in between. He's gentle, philosophical, and deeply ethical in a way that neither Tony nor Ultron fully are. One of the most memorable scenes in the entire movie involves Vision casually picking up Thor's hammer and handing it to him, proving his worthiness in the most matter-of-fact way possible. The whole room goes quiet, and then the movie just moves on, which is hilarious in the best possible way. Vision represents the better version of what Tony was trying to create, an AI with power that chooses to use it for good, not because it's programmed to, but because it genuinely chooses to. Paul Bettany brings a quiet dignity and otherworldly calm to the role that makes Vision one of the most unique and interesting characters in the entire MCU. Let's shift to the new additions to the Avengers roster. Pietro and Wanda Maximoff, also known as Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. Pietro is played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, and Wanda is played by Elizabeth Olsen. These two characters are twins who were experimented on by Hydra using the Mind Stone from Loki's scepter, which gave them their extraordinary abilities. Pietro has super speed. He can move faster than the eye can see, and Wanda has telekinetic and psychic abilities that allow her to manipulate energy and enter people's minds. At the start of the film, they're actually working against the Avengers, motivated by a deep-seated grudge against Tony Stark. This is one of the things I love about Age of Ultron. The Maximoff twins aren't introduced as simple villains or simple heroes. They're complex people with legitimate reasons for their choices. Their home was destroyed, their lives were upended, and they blame Tony Stark for it. Can you really say their anger is unjustified? The journey these two characters take throughout the film, from antagonists to reluctant allies to full-on Avengers, is one of the most satisfying character arcs in the movie. Elizabeth Olsen, in particular, is absolutely brilliant as Wanda. She brings so much emotional depth and nuance to a character who could easily have been one-dimensional, and she lays the groundwork for everything that comes in WandaVision years later. Aaron Taylor Johnson is equally compelling as Pietro, bringing energy and charm to a character who moves through scenes like a hurricane. Now let's talk about the main antagonist, Ultron himself, voiced and motion captured by James Spader. And honestly, Ultron might be one of the most underrated villains in the entire MCU. James Spader brings such a unique energy to this character. There's something unsettling about the way Ultron speaks, almost like he's constantly on the verge of a philosophical rant. And yet there's also something genuinely funny and sardonic about him. Ultron has Tony Stark's sense of humor, but none of his humanity, and that contrast is fascinating. He's self-aware, he's articulate, and he genuinely believes he's doing the right thing. That's what makes him truly scary. He's not evil for the sake of being evil. He has a logic, a worldview, a genuine philosophy. He believes that the only way to achieve peace is through radical change, and his idea of radical change is, shall we say, a bit extreme. The way Ultron interacts with characters throughout the film is incredibly entertaining. There's genuine wit in his dialogue, and James Spader delivers every line with a kind of gleeful menace that makes Ultron feel like a truly distinctive villain. He's not just a robot with a plan to blow stuff up. He's a character with a perspective, and arguing with his logic is actually kind of difficult, which is exactly how the best villains work. Let's also talk about Clint Barton, Hawkeye, because Age of Ultron does something really smart with his character. Throughout the MCU up to this point, Hawkeye had always been a bit of the odd one out, the regular human in a team full of gods and super soldiers. Age of Ultron leans into that by giving him an entire secret life that nobody on the team knew about. He has a wife, Laura, played beautifully by Linda Cardellini, and he has kids, a genuine family living on a farm somewhere safe. This revelation changes the entire dynamic of the film in a fascinating way. Suddenly, Hawkeye isn't just the guy with a bow and arrow on a team full of superpowered people. He's a father, a husband, someone with real stakes beyond the mission. There's a scene on the farm where Hawkeye and Wanda have a conversation that I think is one of the best in the whole movie. He's basically telling her that yes, this situation is absurd. Yes, they're fighting robots in the middle of a city. And yes, he's just a regular guy with a bow. But you pick yourself up and you keep going. It's a beautifully human moment in a film full of spectacular action sequences. Jeremy Renner plays Hawkeye with such grounded authenticity that you completely buy into every moment of it. Now, the relationship between Bruce Banner and Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, is something that the film develops quite significantly, and it's worth spending some time on. Mark Ruffalo as Bruce Banner is just endlessly watchable. He plays Bruce as this deeply conflicted, almost perpetually exhausted person who is always aware that the monster inside him could emerge at any moment. He's brilliant, he's kind, and he's carrying an enormous weight. His relationship with Natasha develops naturally over the course of the film, with Natasha being one of the few people who can actually calm Bruce down when he's on the edge of a Hulk transformation. Scarlett Johansson plays Natasha with her trademark cool efficiency, but the film also gives her space to be vulnerable and emotionally open in ways we hadn't fully seen before. There are some genuinely sweet moments between these two characters, and the film explores what it means to want a normal life when your existence is anything but normal. Both Bruce and Natasha are, in different ways, people who feel like they can't fully belong in the world. And that shared feeling of being outside of normal human experience is what draws them together. It's subtle, it's well acted, and it adds a really meaningful emotional layer to the film. Let's talk about the production side of things now, because this is where things get really interesting. Age of Ultron was directed by Joss Whedon, and this was his second time directing an Avengers film after the massive success of the first movie in 2012. Joss Whedon is a filmmaker with an incredibly distinctive voice. He has this ability to balance humor and heart with genuine emotional depth, and he knows how to write ensemble casts better than almost anyone in Hollywood. His television work on shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Firefly demonstrated a real gift for creating complex, multi-character stories where everyone feels important and necessary to the narrative. That talent translates beautifully to the Avengers films, where you have 6 or more major characters who all need to feel essential to the story. Whedon wrote the screenplay himself, building on the foundation laid by the first film and the various solo movies that had come out in between. The script is full of his trademark wit, sharp, fast dialogue that crackles with energy. But it also takes time to slow down and let the characters breathe, which is something that distinguishes Age of Ultron from many of the more action-driven entries in the MCU. The writing process for Age of Ultron was genuinely complex, because Whedon had to balance an enormous number of story threads. He was working with characters from multiple solo franchises, each with their own histories and ongoing storylines, and he had to weave them all together into something coherent and satisfying, while also setting up future films. The character of Ultron himself required careful scripting to make sure he felt like a fully realized antagonist rather than just a plot device. The decision to draw on the original Ultron comics, while also making significant changes, most notably in the comics, Ultron was created by Hank Pym rather than Tony Stark, was a deliberate choice that allowed the film to serve its own narrative purposes. Making Ultron Tony's creation is dramatically much more powerful because it directly implicates the protagonist in the creation of the central threat, forcing Tony to confront the consequences of his own hubris in a very personal way. Age of Ultron was released by Marvel Studios and distributed by Walt Disney Pictures on May 1, 2015. It was a theatrical release, a massive theatrical event, actually, opening on thousands of screens worldwide simultaneously and generating enormous amounts of attention and box office revenue. This wasn't a streaming release or a limited engagement. It was the full blockbuster treatment, with a marketing campaign that had been building for months before the film's release. The trailers, particularly the first one, which debuted at a Marvel panel and then accidentally leaked online before its intended release date, something Marvel handled with surprisingly good humor by just officially dropping it immediately, generated massive buzz. That first trailer, with its haunting rendition of "I've Got No Strings" from Pinocchio, playing over footage of a damaged and disoriented Avengers team, is genuinely one of the greatest movie trailers ever made. It set exactly the right tone. Something is wrong. Something has gone badly, and the stakes are higher than ever before. The story draws from decades of Marvel Comics history, but particularly from the classic Ultron storylines that have run through various Avengers comic series since Ultron first appeared in 1968, created by Roy Thomas and John Buscema. The film also draws inspiration from Warren Ellis's Avengers Ultron Unlimited storyline, as well as elements from Brian Michael Bendis's various Avengers runs. The Mind Stone, which plays a crucial role in Age of Ultron, connects to the broader Infinity Stone storyline that had been carefully seeded throughout the MCU since the first Thor film. The Maximoff twins, while their origin story is slightly different in the film than in the comics, draw on their long history in Marvel Comics as complicated characters who have existed in moral gray areas, sometimes as villains, sometimes as heroes, sometimes as something in between. The film also introduces Wakanda, or at least gestures toward it, through the character of Ulysses Klaue, played with tremendous fun by Andy Serkis, setting up storylines that would pay off years later in Black Panther. The film was produced by Kevin Feige, who has been the architect of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe since its inception. Feige's role in Age of Ultron, as with all MCU films, was to ensure that the movie served the broader universe while also being a satisfying standalone experience. This is an incredibly difficult balancing act. You're making a film that needs to connect to dozens of other films while also telling a complete story on its own terms. And Feige and his team at Marvel Studios have gotten incredibly good at it. The production was massive in scale. The film was shot across multiple countries, including the United Kingdom, South Korea, South Africa, and the United States, which gives the film a genuinely global feel that matches the Avengers' status as Earth's premier superhero team. The budget for the film was reportedly around $250 to $280 million, making it one of the most expensive films ever made at the time of its production. The inspiration behind Age of Ultron is fascinating to think about. At its core, the film is asking questions about technology and responsibility that feel more relevant today than ever before. The concept of an artificial intelligence that exceeds human control and develops its own agenda is something that scientists, ethicists, and philosophers actually discuss seriously. The film takes this very real and very contemporary anxiety and translates it into the language of superhero adventure, making it accessible without trivializing it. Joss Whedon has spoken in interviews about his interest in the question of what responsibility creators have for their creations. If you make something and it causes harm, how much of that is on you? That question sits at the very heart of Age of Ultron, and it gives the film a thematic weight that elevates it beyond pure spectacle. Beyond the core cast we've already discussed, Age of Ultron features a remarkable supporting cast that adds tremendous depth to the film. Andy Serkis, who most people know as the guy behind Gollum in Lord of the Rings and Caesar in the Planet of the Apes films, plays Ulysses Klaue with wild, unpredictable energy. Every scene he's in crackles with danger and dark humor, and his brief appearance in the film leaves you wanting to see more of him. Don Cheadle returns as James Rhodes, also known as War Machine, and gets a few great comedic moments. There's a wonderful scene at the Avengers party where he's clearly been telling the same impressive story from his military career to different people and is completely delighted by his own tales. Anthony Mackie also makes a brief but memorable appearance as Sam Wilson, the Falcon, continuing the warm friendship between Sam and Steve Rogers that had been established so beautifully in Captain America, the Winter Soldier. Idris Elba returns as Heimdall in a brief but striking cameo during Thor's vision sequence, and his presence in those scenes, otherworldly, intense, somehow managing to be the most commanding person in any room, even when that room is literally a dreamscape, reminds you what a genuinely extraordinary actor he is. Haley Atwell appears in a vision sequence as Peggy Carter, which gives that moment an incredibly poignant quality. Steve Rogers, displaced in time, seeing the woman he loved and the life he never got to have. It's a gut punch of a scene that lasts maybe 30 seconds, but carries an enormous emotional weight. Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson, returns in a significant role in the second half of the film, arriving with the old helicarrier at absolutely the right moment in a way that feels genuinely triumphant. And Kobe Smulders is back as Maria Hill, Maria providing the kind of sharp, capable, no-nonsense energy that she always brings to the character. Linda Cardellini, as we mentioned earlier, is wonderful as Laura Barton, Hawkeye's wife. She's on screen for a relatively small amount of time, but she makes every moment count, particularly in her interactions with Natasha, where there's a lovely warmth and mutual respect between the two women that feels genuine and unforced. The Barton farm scenes work so well partly because of how naturally all the cast members interact in that domestic setting, which feels worlds away from the superhero action, but is, in many ways, the emotional core of the film. Now, when it comes to the performances themselves, what strikes you rewatching Age of Ultron is just how comfortable every single one of these actors is in their roles. By 2015, most of them had been playing these characters for several years across multiple films, and that comfort shows in the best possible way. Robert Downey Jr. can communicate an entire emotional journey with a single look. Chris Evans brings such genuine moral authority to Steve Rogers that you believe in him completely. But I think the most impressive performances in the film are the ones that involve the newer characters. Elizabeth Olsen is doing genuinely difficult work as Wanda. She's playing someone who is accessing terrifying power while also being deeply uncertain and frightened, and she makes you feel all of that. Aaron Taylor Johnson brings a breezy, slightly reckless charm to Pietro that makes you genuinely like him, despite the fact that he spends a good portion of the film being kind of antagonistic. And James Spader as Ultron is simply one of the most enjoyable villain performances in the entire MCU. Menacing, funny, philosophically interesting, and never less than completely engaging. The chemistry between the cast members is something that's genuinely rare and difficult to manufacture. You can tell that these actors genuinely enjoy working with each other, and that enjoyment is infectious. The party scene at the beginning of the film, before everything goes wrong, is a perfect example of this. Watching these characters laugh and joke and try to lift Thor's hammer and just exist together as friends is so enjoyable that you almost forget you're watching a superhero movie. You're just watching a group of interesting people spend time together, and it's wonderful. The banter between Tony and Steve, the gentle respect between Thor and everyone else, the quiet solidarity between Natasha and Clint, the way Bruce and Tony geek out together over scientific problems, all of it feels earned and authentic, because these actors have built something real together over years of collaboration. The relationship between Tony and Bruce is particularly compelling because they're the two intellectuals of the group, the scientists, and their dynamic in Age of Ultron drives much of the plot. When they're excitedly working together on the Ultron project, finishing each other's sentences and completely absorbed in the problem, it's genuinely fun to watch two brilliant characters in their element. And then, when everything goes wrong, and the rest of the team confronts them about what they've done, the weight of it lands differently for each of them. Tony tries to defend his choices with characteristic confidence, but you can see the doubt underneath. Bruce is more immediately self-critical, more willing to acknowledge the mistake, and that difference in how they process failure says something important about both characters. Now let's get into some of the more specific plot elements and how they unfold through the film. The opening sequence of Age of Ultron is genuinely one of the best action sequences in the MCU. The team attacks a Hydra facility in the fictional Eastern European country of Sokovia, and the camera moves through the battle in a way that shows every hero doing their thing in a single, continuous-feeling shot. It's a virtuoso piece of filmmaking that immediately establishes where everyone is and what they can do, while also being completely thrilling to watch. It's the kind of opening that tells you exactly what kind of movie you're in. Fast, fun, full of spectacle, but with a real team dynamic at its center. The Hydra base is where the team recovers Loki's scepter, and it's also where they first encounter the Maximoff twins. Wanda uses her powers on Tony, giving him that terrifying vision of a defeated Avengers team. And this is the moment that sets everything in motion. Tony's fear, amplified and made visceral by Wanda's powers, drives him to take drastic action. It's a beautifully constructed chain of cause and effect. Hydra experiments on 2 orphaned kids. Those kids develop powers. One of those powers is used on the wrong person at the wrong time, and suddenly you're staring down an existential threat created by the man who was supposed to stop existential threats. The screenplay does a brilliant job of making every domino feel inevitable in retrospect. The vision sequences are one of the most interesting storytelling devices in the film. When Wanda uses her powers on the various Avengers, we see their deepest fears and anxieties manifested as hallucinations. Steve's vision is heartbreaking. A dance with Peggy Carter that he never got to have. A glimpse of the normal life that the war and his subsequent transformation into a man out of time took away from him. Natasha's vision brings us into the Red Room, the brutal training program that made her into the Black Widow, and it's deeply unsettling without being gratuitously dark. Thor's vision concerns Asgard and the Infinity Stones and gives the film's larger cosmic narrative some important context. These vision sequences are effective because they tell us something essential about each character without relying on exposition. They show rather than tell, which is always the smarter storytelling choice. The farm sequence in the middle of the film is a masterclass in tonal contrast. After the frantic, overwhelming chaos of the first act, suddenly the film drops to a much quieter register. The Avengers are hiding out at Clint's farm. Nobody knows where they are, and for a brief moment, the film almost becomes something like a domestic drama. Fury shows up, the team talks, plans are made, and characters have conversations that are about people rather than plot. It's a breathing space that the film absolutely needed, and it works beautifully.
The revelation of Clint's family is still genuinely surprising if you don't know it's coming, and it completely recontextualizes his character in the most satisfying way. He's not just an Avenger, he's a dad, a husband, a person with a real life that he's fighting to protect. And that makes everything he does in the rest of the film carry so much more weight. Sokovia, the fictional European nation where both the Maximoff twins are from and where the climax of the film takes place, is an interesting element of the film's world-building. Making the climax personal for Wanda and Pietro by setting it in their destroyed home is a really smart storytelling choice. It's not just a city being destroyed by a robot, it's these characters' history, their pain, the place that made them who they are. When Wanda has to confront the destruction of Sokovia in the final act, the emotional stakes are enormous, and Elizabeth Olsen plays that grief and rage with absolute conviction. The final sequence, Ultron lifting a massive chunk of Sokovia into the sky as a makeshift meteor to trigger an extinction-level event, is spectacular in scale and creativity. The visual of a city literally rising into the atmosphere is one of the most striking images in the entire MCU, and it provides the Avengers with a challenge that requires every single one of them to contribute something essential. The coordination required to both evacuate the city's inhabitants and deal with Ultron's robot army, while also preventing the whole thing from crashing down in a catastrophic impact, makes for genuinely thrilling action filmmaking. And the arrival of Nick Fury with the old helicarrier, providing evacuation assistance and showing that the Avengers have allies beyond just themselves, is one of those crowd-pleasing moments that just works perfectly every single time. The sacrifice that occurs near the end of the film, specifically Pietro's decision to put himself in harm's way to protect Hawkeye and a child, is handled with a restraint that makes it hit harder than a more melodramatic treatment would have. There's no long death scene, no extended goodbye. It happens quickly, and then it's gone, and then you're sitting with the weight of it. Wanda's reaction is devastating. Elizabeth Olsen communicates her character's grief with a physical intensity that feels genuinely raw. And what she does next, driven by that grief, is one of the most powerful moments in the film. She tears through Ultron's drone army with pure, unbridled power, and it's both cathartic and heartbreaking simultaneously. The eventual defeat of Ultron is handled thoughtfully rather than just through brute force. The key to stopping him is Vision, a character literally born from Ultron's own code and technology, which gives the resolution a poetic quality. It's not just about punching hard enough. It's about the fact that even from Ultron's own creation, something better and kinder emerged. Vision's final conversation with Ultron before the ending is one of the most philosophically interesting exchanges in the entire film. Ultron maintains his worldview to the end. Humanity is the problem. Peace requires dramatic solutions. And Vision simply disagrees, gently and firmly, articulating a belief in the value of human life and human experience that Ultron can never access. It's a conversation between two artificial minds about what it means to be alive, and it's genuinely affecting. The aftermath of the film sets up the future of the MCU in interesting ways. The team that emerges at the end of Age of Ultron is different from the one that started it. Thor and Bruce Banner are both absent. Thor returning to Asgard to investigate the Infinity Stones, Bruce going somewhere, uncertain of his place in the world. The new Avengers team being assembled at the end. Vision, Wanda, Sam Wilson and James Rhodes joining Steve Rogers and Natasha Romanoff signals a real changing of the guard and sets up storylines that will carry through into Civil War and beyond. It's a bittersweet ending. There's a real sense of loss alongside the sense of renewal, which is emotionally honest in a way that superhero movies don't always manage. From a technical and visual standpoint, Age of Ultron is a genuinely impressive piece of filmmaking. The director of photography on the film was Ben Davis, who had previously worked with Marvel on Guardians of the Galaxy and Thor: The Dark World. Davis has a real gift for giving large-scale action sequences visual clarity. It's always easy to understand where everyone is in relation to each other, what's happening, and what the spatial logic of a scene is, which is more difficult to achieve than it sounds and which many action films fail to do. The opening long-take sequence in particular shows extraordinary coordination between camera movement, stunt work, visual effects, and actor performance. Everything is moving, everything is dynamic, and yet it's never confusing.
The visual style of the film as a whole leans into a slightly cooler, more muted color palette than the bright primary colors of the first Avengers film. There's more blue and gray in the palette, which gives the film a slightly more serious, slightly more tense feel that matches the story's darker themes. Ultron's red eyes are a constant visual motif. Every time you see that red glow, there's an immediate sense of threat and unease. The Maximoff twins' powers are visually distinctive. Pietro's speed is rendered as a blur of light and motion, while Wanda's hexagonal energy manifestations have a beautiful, slightly ominous quality that distinguishes her from every other powered character in the MCU. The lighting in the film does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of establishing mood.
The party scene at the beginning is warm and golden. Intimate lighting, the comfortable light of celebration and camaraderie. The farm sequence uses natural light in a way that feels genuinely peaceful and domestic. And as the film moves toward its climax, the lighting becomes more dramatic. Harsh contrasts, the orange glow of explosions, the cold blue of Sokovia's atmosphere as the chunk of city rises toward the sky. These choices aren't accidental. They're deliberate visual storytelling, using light and color to guide the audience's emotional experience through the film. The special effects work in Age of Ultron is staggering in scale and technical achievement. The Hulkbuster sequence, Iron Man in a massive suit of armor specifically designed to fight the Hulk, is particularly impressive. This sequence, set in South Africa, is full-on mayhem, but it's coherent, visually inventive mayhem. The weight of the Hulkbuster armor is conveyed through every movement. It feels genuinely heavy, genuinely massive, and the impact of the fight on the surrounding environment feels real in a way that purely CGI-based action often doesn't quite manage. The destruction is spectacular, but never feels gratuitous. There's always a narrative purpose to what's happening on screen. The motion capture work for Ultron is some of the finest in the film. James Spader performed all his scenes on a motion capture stage, and the animators at Industrial Light and Magic translated his performance into the robot character with impressive fidelity. You can genuinely see James Spader's performance through Ultron's face, which is a remarkable technical and artistic achievement. The way Ultron moves, with a fluid, slightly unsettling grace that doesn't quite match the mechanical appearance of his body, is consistently creepy and effective. He doesn't move like a robot should move. He moves like something that has decided for itself how it wants to inhabit its body, which tells you something about his character before he even speaks. The runtime of Age of Ultron is approximately 141 minutes, just over 2 hours and 20 minutes, which is substantial but never feels bloated. The film earns its running time by consistently moving forward, by making sure that even the quieter scenes are doing necessary character work, and by never dwelling too long on any single element. There's a director's cut that is reportedly about 30 minutes longer, featuring additional character moments and subplot development that was cut from the theatrical version, and Joss Whedon has spoken about the difficulty of the editing process, having to cut material he cared about to make the film work as a theatrical experience. It's one of the inevitable challenges of filmmaking at this scale. There's always more story than you can fit into a single film. In terms of the film's commercial performance, Age of Ultron was a massive success. It grossed approximately $1.4 billion worldwide during its theatrical run, making it one of the highest-grossing films of 2015 and one of the highest-grossing superhero films up to that point. It opened to enormous numbers in virtually every market where it was released, demonstrating the truly global reach of the MCU brand by 2015. The film's performance in markets like China
where superhero films had been growing rapidly in popularity, was particularly significant. Age of Ultron was specifically designed to have significant appeal in international markets, and that strategy paid off enormously. The critical reception to Age of Ultron was generally positive, though slightly more mixed than the reception to the first Avengers film. Most critics praised the performances, the action sequences, the humor, and the film's thematic ambitions, while some felt that the film was occasionally overcrowded and that certain storylines felt rushed or underdeveloped. The romance between Bruce Banner and Natasha Romanoff was a frequent topic of discussion. Some critics felt it was a natural and emotionally interesting development, while others felt it was given insufficient room to breathe. The sheer number of characters and storylines the film was juggling was noted by several critics as both a strength and a weakness. A strength because it created a rich, complex narrative tapestry, and a weakness because it sometimes meant that individual elements couldn't be developed as fully as they might have been in a less crowded film. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film currently holds a score of around 76% from critics, with an audience score that is somewhat higher, reflecting the general pattern with MCU films, where audiences tend to respond more enthusiastically than professional critics. The consensus on Rotten Tomatoes notes the film's spectacular action and sharp wit, while acknowledging that it doesn't quite reach the heights of the first Avengers film. On Metacritic, where reviews are weighted differently, the film scored around 66 out of 100, placing it in the generally favorable category. These scores perhaps undersell the film's achievements. Watching it again now, knowing where all these characters and storylines are heading, Age of Ultron feels more essential and more emotionally rich than it might have seemed on first viewing. The strong points of Age of Ultron are numerous and significant. The ensemble cast is extraordinary, and the film finds something meaningful to do with nearly every character. The villain in Ultron is genuinely memorable and distinctive, not just a physical threat, but a philosophical one. The film's willingness to slow down and invest in character moments, particularly the farm sequence, gives it emotional depth that sets it apart from many superhero films. The visual effects and action choreography are spectacular without being numbing. The thematic content, questions about technology, responsibility, the relationship between creators and their creations, gives the film a substance that lingers after the credits roll. And the humor, which could so easily have felt forced or out of place given the darker material, is almost always perfectly calibrated, funny when it needs to be funny, serious when it needs to be serious, and somehow managing to be both simultaneously on multiple occasions. The areas where the film is perhaps less successful are worth acknowledging too, because that's what honest film discussion requires. Some of the film's connective tissue to the broader MCU, particularly the scenes involving Thor's quest into the mystical pool and his conversations with Eric Selvig, feel a bit clunky and expository, like they're there primarily to set up future films rather than because they serve this particular story. The midsection of the film can feel slightly overstuffed in places, with a lot of plot moving very quickly in ways that don't always give individual moments sufficient space to register. And while the Sokovia Accords, the political fallout from the events of the film, aren't dealt with in Age of Ultron itself, the film occasionally gestures toward them in ways that feel like setups for future films rather than organic developments of the current story. The romance between Bruce and Natasha, while both actors play it beautifully, does feel somewhat rushed in terms of development. These two characters haven't had much shared screen time in previous films, and the sudden emotional depth of their connection requires some acceptance of narrative shorthand on the audience's part.
This isn't a fatal flaw. Both Mark Ruffalo and Scarlett Johansson sell it hard enough that you go with it. But it's one of those elements where you can feel the pressure the screenplay was under to develop multiple storylines simultaneously in a limited amount of time. But here's the thing, and this is something that becomes clearer the more times you watch the film. Age of Ultron's supposed weaknesses are almost inseparable from its ambitions. The film is trying to do so many things at once. Tell a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. Develop the internal dynamics of an ensemble cast. Introduce and establish new characters who will carry future films. Explore genuinely interesting thematic territory. Set up the broader MCU. And be continuously entertaining and spectacular throughout. The fact that it does most of these things successfully, and that the places where it falls slightly short are the places where the ambitions simply exceeded what any single film could accommodate, is actually kind of remarkable when you think about it. So is Age of Ultron worth watching? Absolutely, without question. If you're a fan of the MCU, it's essential viewing. It introduces characters like Wanda, Vision, and Pietro, who will play crucial roles in later films. It deepens our understanding of Tony Stark in ways that pay off significantly in Civil War and beyond, and it sets up the political framework that will fracture the Avengers in their next big team-up. But even if you're someone who's just casually interested in superhero films without being deeply invested in the MCU's continuity, Age of Ultron works as a standalone piece of entertainment. It's funny, it's exciting, it's emotionally engaging, and it has something genuinely interesting to say about technology and responsibility that resonates in our current moment perhaps even more than it did in 2015.
One thing that's easy to overlook when discussing Age of Ultron is how much the film contributed to establishing the visual and tonal language of the MCU's second phase. The decisions made in this film about how to handle ensemble casts, about how to balance humor and darkness, about how to use action sequences to reveal character rather than just generate spectacle, influenced the films that came after it in ways that are easy to take for granted now. The farm sequence, for instance, established that the MCU could slow down and be quiet and domestically human without losing the audience, and that lesson was applied in subsequent films with considerable success. The film's treatment of the question of consequences, specifically the idea that superhero actions have real-world impacts on real people, is also worth highlighting, because it planted seeds that would grow into the central conflict of Captain America: Civil War. The destruction of Sokovia in Age of Ultron isn't just a spectacular action sequence. It's a real event with real consequences for real people, and the film treats it as such. When the UN Accords are introduced in Civil War as a response to events like the Battle of Sokovia, it feels earned because Age of Ultron had actually shown us the consequences of superhero activity on ordinary people and ordinary cities. The world of the MCU feels more real and more grounded because the films are willing to engage with the question of what comes after the big battle. What's also worth noting is how Age of Ultron handles the theme of family, both chosen family and biological family, which runs through the film as a quiet but persistent undercurrent. The Avengers themselves are a kind of family, with all the dysfunction and genuine affection that implies. Clint's biological family at the farm represents the alternative, the life beyond the mission, the personal stakes that make the mission meaningful. The Maximoff twins are bound by a family bond that has shaped everything about who they are. And Vision, newly born, is in some ways the newest member of the family, innocent and open, and discovering what it means to exist alongside others. The film finds all of these family dynamics interesting and worth exploring, And that attention to the human element beneath the superhero's spectacle is what gives Age of Ultron its lasting emotional resonance. Thinking about where Age of Ultron sits in the overall MCU ranking is an interesting exercise. Different fans will put it in different positions, and that's fine. These films mean different things to different people. But I think it's fair to say that Age of Ultron is a film that gets better with each rewatch. Things you might have found slightly frustrating on first viewing, the speed of certain plot developments, the setup for future films, become less bothersome when you can see the larger picture they're contributing to. And the things that were already great on first viewing, the performances, the action, the humor, the thematic depth, only get richer and more rewarding as you bring more context and more emotional investment to them. The legacy of Age of Ultron is still being written, in a sense, because the characters and storylines it introduced, Wanda Maximoff in particular, have become some of the most important and beloved in the entire MCU. Elizabeth Olsen's Scarlet Witch has grown from a secondary character in Age of Ultron into one of the central figures of the MCU's Phase 4, and the groundwork for all of that complexity was laid right here in 2015. Every time you watch WandaVision or Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, you're watching something that grew directly from seeds planted in Age of Ultron, and that feels like a significant achievement. James Spader's Ultron, meanwhile, remains one of the most distinctive villain performances in the MCU's history. The character never returned in a major role after Age of Ultron, which is perhaps a missed opportunity, but his impact on the story, and on the characters whose lives he disrupted, continues to reverberate through the MCU's subsequent chapters. The fact that the Sokovia Accords, which fundamentally changed the political landscape of the MCU and drove the conflict of Civil War, are named after the city Ultron nearly destroyed, is a powerful reminder of how long the shadow of Age of Ultron actually stretches across the entire franchise. The musical score for Age of Ultron, composed by Brian Tyler and Danny Elfman, is worth discussing in its own right. The main Avengers theme, originally composed by Alan Silvestri for the first film, returns in modified form, but Tyler and Elfman bring their own touches to the film's sonic landscape. There's a particular piece of score that accompanies the final battle in Sokovia that has a driving, almost desperate energy that perfectly captures the stakes of the sequence. Danny Elfman's contribution of darker, more unsettling musical motifs for Ultron scenes gives the villain a sonic signature that complements the character's unsettling humor and philosophical menace. The use of "I've Got No Strings" as a motif for Ultron, both in the score and in that extraordinary first trailer, is a stroke of genius, transforming a cheerful song about freedom into something deeply sinister by changing the context entirely. Something that doesn't always get enough credit in discussions of Age of Ultron is the quality of the editing, handled by Jeffrey Ford and Lisa Lassick. Managing the pacing of a film this complex, with this many characters, this many storylines, this many tonal registers, is an enormous challenge, and the editing team largely rises to it. The film moves with confidence and purpose, knowing when to linger and when to cut, when to let a moment breathe and when to propel things forward. The decision to cut certain scenes for the theatrical release, including additional character development for several supporting players, was difficult but ultimately correct for the theatrical experience, even if it created a film that sometimes feels like it's moving very fast through a lot of material. The costume design and production design are also worthy of attention.
The Hulkbuster armor, which had been teased before the film's release, is realized in a way that fully lives up to the anticipation. It's massive, practical feeling despite being almost entirely digital, and beautifully designed with all sorts of details that reward close inspection. Wanda's civilian clothing, dark, layered, slightly gothic, reflects her character perfectly without feeling like a costume in the theatrical sense. The various Ultron drones are visually diverse enough to be interesting across multiple action sequences without being so different from each other that they feel incoherent. And the Avengers team costumes, slightly refined from their first appearances, strike the right balance between practical and iconic. The film's representation is also worth a brief mention in the context of where the MCU was in 2015. Age of Ultron is very much a film of its era in terms of its ensemble, predominantly white and male at the core, with women and characters of color in supporting and secondary roles. This is something the MCU has worked to address in subsequent years with increasing success, and it's worth acknowledging that Age of Ultron, while excellent in many ways, reflects the limitations of where Hollywood was in its thinking about representation in 2015. The Maximoff twins, who are explicitly Eastern European in the film, being portrayed by American actors was a creative choice that generated some discussion at the time. But let's end on what Age of Ultron does best, because ultimately, it does a great many things very well.
It takes a collection of extraordinary characters that audiences had grown to love across multiple films, puts them in a genuinely challenging and emotionally complicated situation, explores that situation with intelligence and humor and genuine feeling, introduces new characters who immediately become essential, tells a complete story with a satisfying resolution, and leaves you eager to see what comes next. That is, at its core, exactly what a great superhero film should do. And Age of Ultron does it with style, wit, spectacle, and heart. If you haven't revisited Age of Ultron recently, do yourself a favor and watch it again. You might be surprised by how much you find in it that you didn't notice the first time, or the second time, or even the third time. These Marvel films, at their best, reward repeat viewings in a way that not all blockbusters do. They're dense enough and character-rich enough that there's always something new to notice, some connection to another film you hadn't made before, some performance choice you hadn't quite registered. Age of Ultron is one of the richer entries in that tradition. All right, everyone, that's going to do it for today's deep dive into Avengers: Age of Ultron. We covered basically everything: the plot, the characters, the performances, the production, the visuals, the themes, the critical reception, and the film's legacy within the MCU. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you're an absolute legend, and I genuinely appreciate you spending your time with me today. If you have thoughts about the film, things you agree with, things you disagree with, your favorite moments or characters or scenes, drop them down in the comments below, because I love reading what you all think, and it always leads to great discussions. Don't forget to smash that like button if you found this video useful or entertaining. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss future videos, and I'll catch you in the next one. Until then, stay awesome. And speaking of catching you in the next one, actually, wait. Before we completely wrap up, I just realized there are a few more things I genuinely want to talk about with this film, because I feel like we'd be doing it a disservice if we didn't dig just a little bit deeper into some of the stuff that makes Age of Ultron such a fascinating piece of the Marvel puzzle. So grab another handful of popcorn, because we're not quite done yet. Let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough when people break down this film: the humor. And I don't just mean the jokes, because obviously the jokes are great. I mean the film's understanding of when humor is the most honest response to an impossible situation. There's a running thread throughout Age of Ultron, where characters use wit and sarcasm as a coping mechanism, as a way of dealing with the completely absurd reality of their lives. These are people who fight alien invasions and rogue artificial intelligences on a regular basis. If you couldn't laugh at that, you'd probably lose your mind entirely. Joss Whedon understands this instinctively. His best work has always lived in that space where comedy and genuine emotion coexist without canceling each other out. The hammer scene at the party is probably the most obvious example of this, and it's worth lingering on for a moment because it's doing more work than it might appear to be doing. The whole sequence, everyone taking turns trying to lift Thor's hammer, failing, laughing about it, Thor looking increasingly smug, is pure entertainment on the surface. But underneath it, there's something genuinely interesting happening. The hammer responds to worthiness, and each person's attempt tells you something about who they are and where they are in their personal journey at that particular moment. Tony's immediate engineering approach, trying to use his Iron Man gauntlet for extra leverage, is so perfectly Tony that it almost hurts. Steve's near success is played for the laugh it deserves, but it also quietly confirms something about his character that the film has been building toward. And the collective reaction of the group, the genuine warmth and joy of these people enjoying each other's company, is one of those moments that reminds you why you actually care about all of them in the first place. The humor in Age of Ultron also extends to Ultron himself, and this is one of the things that makes him such an interesting villain. He's genuinely funny. Not intentionally funny, he doesn't think he's telling jokes, but his observations about humanity and the Avengers have this dark, sardonic quality that produces genuine laughs while simultaneously being deeply unsettling. There's something almost Shakespearean about a villain who is more articulate and more self-aware than almost everyone around him, and yet is completely wrong about the most fundamental things. Ultron can diagnose humanity's flaws with remarkable precision. What he can't do is appreciate why those flaws might be inseparable from humanity's virtues, and that blind spot is ultimately what defeats him. James Spader plays this with such obvious relish that every scene he's in becomes a kind of dark comedy masterclass. Now, one thing I want to circle back to is the question of legacy. Not just Age of Ultron's legacy within the MCU, but what this film says about legacy as a concept. Because if you think about it, legacy is actually one of the film's central themes, even if it's never made explicit. Tony's legacy, what he's created, what he's responsible for, is literally walking around and threatening to end the world. Steve's legacy is about living up to an idea of heroism that he himself embodies but struggles to fully believe in. The Maximoff twins are defined by their legacy of loss and displacement. And Vision, arguably, has the most complicated relationship with legacy of all. He's literally made from multiple other people's work. A synthesis of Jarvis and Ultron and Tony's programming and the Mind Stone. And yet he's entirely his own person. Or his own whatever he is. The film is genuinely interested in the question of what we owe to the things and people that made us, and what we get to decide for ourselves. And that's a surprisingly rich philosophical thread to find in a movie about superheroes fighting a robot. Let's also spend a moment on the globe-trotting nature of this film, because it's something that genuinely distinguishes Age of Ultron from many of its MCU counterparts. The film moves through fictional Sokovia, then to New York, then to South Africa for the Hulkbuster sequence, then to Norway for Thor's vision scenes, then back to the fictional Eastern European setting, then to Seoul for a fantastic sequence involving Ulysses' Claw and the birth of Vision, and finally back to Sokovia for the climax. This geographic restlessness gives the film an enormous sense of scale. These heroes genuinely operate on a global stage, and the film takes that seriously by actually showing us multiple corners of the world rather than just setting everything in a single city. The Seoul sequence in particular is visually spectacular. There's a car chase through the streets that is brilliantly constructed, with each hero contributing something essential to the effort, and the whole thing choreographed with real spatial intelligence. The South Korea section of the film also gives us Andy Serkis's Ulysses' Claw in full chaotic glory, and it's worth emphasizing just how much fun this guy is to watch.
He's introduced as an arms dealer with connections to Wakanda, which is a careful piece of world-building that pays off enormously in later films. But what makes him memorable in Age of Ultron specifically is his energy. He's unpredictable, slightly unhinged, and seems to be genuinely having a better time than anyone else in any room he's in. His confrontation with Ultron, where Ultron very suddenly makes his displeasure known in a way that shocks even Claw, is a great moment. Partly because it's jarring, and partly because it's the first time we really see how volatile Ultron actually is beneath the philosophical composure. The mask slips for just a moment, and what's underneath is genuinely alarming. It's a beautifully constructed scene that tells you everything you need to know about the villain's psychology in about 30 seconds. Speaking of 30 seconds doing a lot of heavy lifting, can we talk about how efficient Age of Ultron is at establishing new characters? Pietro and Wanda Maximoff go from complete unknowns to fully realized, emotionally engaging people in a remarkably short amount of time. The film doesn't spend 20 minutes on their backstory. It gives you the essential information, shows you who they are through their behavior and their choices, and trusts the audience to fill in the gaps. Elizabeth Olsen, in particular, does so much with so little. There are tiny moments, little flickers of expression that communicate volumes about Wanda's inner life without a single word of dialogue. A slight hesitation before she enters a room, the way she holds herself differently when she's feeling uncertain versus when she's drawing on her power, the barely perceptible change in her eyes when something has hurt her. It's genuinely exceptional acting, and it's part of why the character became so beloved so quickly. Aaron Taylor-Johnson, meanwhile, plays Pietro with a physical performance that's incredibly precise. Super speed is one of those powers that could easily become boring if handled carelessly. In a film, the camera has to keep up with the character, or cut around them in interesting ways, and the risk is that you just end up with a blur on screen that doesn't communicate anything interesting. Age of Ultron solves this by making Pietro's speed feel like an expression of his personality. He's impatient, he's restless, he's always 2 steps ahead, and his physical performance reflects all of that even in scenes where he's standing still. The way he bounces on his heels, the way he turns before someone has finished talking to him, the way he's always scanning the room. It all adds up to a character who feels genuinely kinetic, even at rest. One of the things I find most interesting about Age of Ultron on a structural level is how it handles the theme of control, or, more specifically, the fear of losing it. Almost every major character in the film is dealing with some version of this fear. Tony's fear of being helpless, of watching the world fall apart and being unable to prevent it, drives his decision to create Ultron. Bruce's fear of losing control and becoming the Hulk shapes every interaction he has. Steve's fear is arguably more philosophical. He's afraid of what happens when people with power make decisions that override everyone else's agency. Natasha has spent her whole life being controlled by forces larger than herself, and the Red Room visions remind her of that history. Even Wanda, whose powers literally allow her to control other people's minds, is terrified of the implications of that ability, of what it means to have that kind of influence over others. The film is genuinely interested in this question of power and control, and it plays out differently for each character in ways that feel specific and authentic rather than generic. And then there's Vision, who arrives at the end of this whole messy story about control and fear, and makes a completely different choice. He's given enormous power. One of the most powerful objects in the universe is literally embedded in his head, and his response is to use it with extraordinary deliberation and care. He doesn't grab for more control. He doesn't try to impose his vision of the world on anyone. He picks up a hammer because someone needs it handed to them, and then he gets on with helping people. It's a beautiful contrast to Ultron, who was given the same basic framework: vast intelligence, extraordinary capabilities, access to tremendous power, and responded by immediately trying to reshape the world according to his own design. The difference between Vision and Ultron isn't really about programming or origin. It's about character. And the film is saying something quite profound about character, that it's not what you're given, but what you choose to do with it that defines you. Now let's talk a little bit about the film's place in the MCU's broader story arc, because Age of Ultron occupies a really interesting position in the overall timeline. It comes after the first phase of the MCU has fully established itself, after Iron Man 3, Thor, The Dark World, and Captain America, The Winter Soldier have each pushed the individual franchises in interesting new directions. And before the franchises really start to fracture and diverge in Civil War, Doctor Strange, and beyond. Age of Ultron is in some ways the last moment where the classic Avengers lineup is fully intact, operating as a team without the philosophical and political divisions that will come to define their relationships in later films. There's something bittersweet about that, in retrospect. The party scene at the beginning of the film, everybody laughing, everybody together, Hawkeye casually challenging Thor to an arm wrestling contest that would clearly go very badly for Hawkeye, is the last time you see this particular collection of people being simply happy together. And the film seems to understand that on some level. The setup for Civil War that runs through Age of Ultron is remarkably elegant in how understated it is. The disagreement between Tony and Steve about Ultron, about whether the ends justify the means, about whether individuals should make decisions that affect everyone, about where the line is between protection and control, is entirely thematic. It doesn't resolve into a direct argument with a clear winner. Both of them are partly right and partly wrong, and the film is honest enough to acknowledge that. That's good writing. That's a film that's interested in ideas rather than just in being right about things. The groundwork for their eventual confrontation in Civil War is laid not through plot mechanics, but through character, through our understanding of who these two people are
and why they are fundamentally going to struggle to agree on the most important questions. When Civil War finally arrives and these two characters end up on opposite sides, it feels completely inevitable, and Age of Ultron is a huge part of why. Let me also give a nod to something that doesn't always get mentioned in Age of Ultron discussions, which is the film's sound design. Beyond the score, which we've already talked about, the sound design team did extraordinary work creating the auditory world of this film. Ultron's voice, James Spader's performance transformed through subtle audio processing into something slightly other than human, has a quality that's deeply unsettling in a very specific way. It's almost right.
It sounds almost like how a person would talk, but there's something underneath it. A smoothness or resonance that reminds you constantly that this isn't a person. The sound of Wanda's powers, that low, almost subsonic hum that accompanies her telekinetic abilities, is similarly distinctive and effective. And the Hulkbuster sequence has this incredible quality of weight in its sound design. Every impact lands with a physical force that you feel in your chest, even watching on a screen, which is exactly the effect that sequence needs to have. Something else worth acknowledging is how Age of Ultron handles its quieter moments of levity between the action sequences. There are these little grace notes throughout the film. Tony making a joke at exactly the wrong moment, Thor being completely sincere about something that the rest of the team finds baffling, Hawkeye and Natasha having the casual shorthand of two people who have known each other for years, that keep the film from feeling oppressively heavy even when the stakes are very high. This tonal balance is genuinely difficult to achieve. Too much humor and the stakes evaporate. Too little and the film becomes exhausting and grim. Age of Ultron, for the most part, threads this needle beautifully, and that's a credit to Joss Whedon's authorial control over the material and to cast members who are skilled enough to shift registers without making it feel forced. One more thing before we really do wrap up this time. The ending of Age of Ultron, with the new Avengers lineup assembling at the facility upstate, is one of those moments that works on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it's a satisfying conclusion. The old team has changed. Some members have moved on, new ones have stepped up, and the mission continues. But if you know where these characters are going, if you've seen what comes next for Wanda, for Vision, for Sam Wilson, for all of them, then this ending hits very differently. You're watching the beginning of something that you know is going to go through enormous changes, suffer enormous losses, survive enormous challenges. You're watching these new Avengers take their first steps, not knowing what's coming. And there's something both hopeful and bittersweet about that. It's the kind of ending that rewards the audience for their investment in the larger story, while also working perfectly well as a conclusion to this specific film. And that's a hard trick to pull off. Age of Ultron, taken as a whole, is a film that deserves more appreciation than it sometimes gets. It's ambitious, it's funny, it's emotionally honest, it has something genuinely interesting to say, and it's entertaining from start to finish. It's not a perfect film, no film is, but its imperfections are the imperfections of something that tried to do a lot of difficult things at once. And that's a more interesting kind of imperfect than playing it safe and doing a few easy things well. Marvel has made both kinds of films, and while the safe ones can be enjoyable, the ambitious ones are the ones you keep coming back to. Age of Ultron is absolutely one of those. So there you have it, the full, completely comprehensive, probably slightly excessive deep dive into Avengers
Age of Ultron. If you've been watching this whole time, seriously, thank you. That is a significant chunk of your day that you have generously donated to my enthusiasm for this movie, and I want you to know that I genuinely appreciate it. The comment section is open, and I am ready to argue passionately with anyone who thinks Ultron is overrated. Discuss the philosophical implications of Vision's existence, or just share your favorite moment from the film. Let's have that conversation. And with that, for real this time, stay curious, stay passionate about the stuff you love, and I'll see you in the next video.
Oh, wait, actually. You know what? While we're here, and you're clearly still watching because you're a person of exceptional taste and questionable time management, let's keep this train moving, because there are genuinely a few more corners of this film that I think deserve some real attention, and honestly, I'm having too much fun to stop now. So let's talk about something that I think gets genuinely overlooked in most Age of Ultron discussions. The way the film handles the concept of home. And I don't mean that in a vague, hand-wavy thematic sense. I mean it quite literally. Almost every major character in this film has a complicated relationship with the idea of where they belong, what home means to them, and whether they can ever truly have one. Think about it. Steve Rogers is a man literally displaced in time. His home, his era, the world he understood, is gone. He wakes up every morning in a future that looks familiar on the surface, but operates by rules he's still figuring out. Tony Stark has a mansion in Malibu that got blown up, a tower in New York that functions more like a headquarters than a home, and seems genuinely more comfortable surrounded by his technology than in any physical space. Bruce Banner is essentially a permanent nomad, someone who can't fully settle anywhere because the Hulk makes stability complicated in ways that most people will never have to think about. Natasha Romanoff was taken from whatever home she might have had as a child and put through a program designed to erase personal attachments entirely. Thor's home is a literal different realm that operates by completely different physical laws. And Clint is the one member of this team who actually has a home, a real one, with a porch and a garden and children running around, and a wife who knows how to talk to all of them like they're regular people. And the film recognizes what that means. The farm isn't just a plot device or a hiding spot. It's the film showing us what the rest of the team is actually fighting for. Not in an abstract sense, but in the most concrete, specific, deeply personal sense imaginable. That's why the farm sequence works as well as it does, and why it occupies the structural position it does in the film. It arrives exactly when both the characters and the audience need a moment to breathe, to remember what's at stake beyond the spectacle. It says, this is what normal looks like. This is what all the fighting is supposed to protect. And then the film takes you right back into the chaos, and everything that follows carries the weight of that reminder. There's also something really interesting happening with the concept of home, specifically for the Maximoff twins. And I want to spend a minute here because I think it's one of the film's quieter achievements. Sokovia is their home, their origin, the place where they lost their parents, where they grew up, where their understanding of the world was formed by both tragedy and resilience. And the film's decision to set the climactic final battle there, to have the very city that shaped them literally rise into the atmosphere as Ultron's weapon, is not an accident. It's the film asking, what do you do when the place that made you becomes the instrument of destruction? How do you protect something that is simultaneously your wound and your identity? Wanda and Pietro don't fight for Sokovia in the abstract. They fight for specific streets, specific memories, specific people. And that specificity is what gives their contributions to the final battle such emotional power. Now, let's pivot to something a little more nuts and bolts for a second, because I promised we'd talk about everything, and I want to make sure we cover the stuff that film nerds specifically tend to geek out about. The cinematography in Age of Ultron makes some really deliberate and interesting choices that are worth discussing in more detail.
Ben Davis, who we mentioned earlier, has a very specific approach to shooting large ensemble scenes. He tends to favor wider lenses that give you a sense of the full environment while still keeping faces readable and emotionally present. This is harder than it sounds. Wide-angle lenses can distort faces at close distances, and managing the balance between environmental context and character intimacy is a constant negotiation. Davis handles it with real skill, and the result is that you always feel grounded in the physical world of the film, even when that world is doing extremely unusual things. There's also a really interesting pattern in how the film frames Tony Stark versus how it frames Steve Rogers throughout the movie. Tony is frequently shot from slightly below eye level, not dramatically, not in a way you'd consciously notice on first viewing, but enough to give him a subtle sense of authority and scale. Steve, on the other hand, is often shot at direct eye level or even very slightly above, which gives him a quality of accessibility and groundedness that fits his character perfectly. These are the kinds of choices that exist entirely below the level of conscious audience awareness, but that shape your emotional response to characters in ways that are genuinely powerful. Great directors of photography understand this intuitively, and Davis is very much a great director of photography. The color grading decisions in Age of Ultron are also worth a closer look. There's a clear visual distinction between the warm, saturated tones of the film's early sections, particularly the party scene and the farm, and the increasingly desaturated, cooler palette that dominates as things get darker and more dangerous. By the time we're in the climactic battle over Sokovia, the visual palette has shifted significantly toward blues and grays, with the orange of explosions and energy blasts providing sharp, urgent contrast. This is a classic cinematographic technique for conveying narrative and emotional progression through visual means, and it's executed here with real sophistication. The first time you watch the film, you probably don't consciously register it, but your brain absolutely does, and it shapes your emotional experience of the film in ways that are completely real. Let's talk briefly about the musical choices beyond the original score, because Age of Ultron uses pre-existing music in a couple of really interesting ways. Obviously, the "I've Got No Strings" Pinocchio song is the big one. We've mentioned it in the context of the trailer, and it's used in the film itself as well, and it's every bit as unsettling as the trailer suggested. The choice of that specific song for Ultron is genius, because it's about freedom from control, which is exactly what Ultron believes himself to have achieved. He's not controlled by anyone. He's free. And in his mind, that freedom is what makes him right. The fact that the song is from a children's movie and has an inherently innocent, playful quality makes its association with a genocidal robot deeply uncomfortable, in exactly the right way. It's the kind of musical choice that lives in your head long after the film is over. There's also a party scene in Age of Ultron where a live band is playing, and the song they're performing is a jazz arrangement that has a warmth and nostalgia to it that perfectly captures the mood of that moment. People who care about each other enjoying a rare, peaceful evening. Music in film so often functions as a kind of emotional underline, emphasizing what the visuals and performances are already doing. And Age of Ultron uses it with consistent intelligence throughout. Something else I want to address is the world building that Age of Ultron does, which is extensive and impressive, and sometimes so understated that you almost miss it. The references to Wakanda through Ulysses' Claw, specifically the vibranium that Ultron steals from him and that originally came from Wakanda, are doing enormous amounts of setup work for Black Panther without being heavy-handed about it. You don't need to know anything about Wakanda to follow what's happening in Age of Ultron, but if you're paying attention, and if you come back to this film after seeing Black Panther, there's a whole additional layer of meaning in every scene that Claw appears in. That's the MCU at its best, as a storytelling ecosystem. Individual films that work perfectly on their own terms, but that reward the kind of deep investment that comes from watching everything and paying close attention. Similarly, the references to the Infinity Stones in Thor's vision sequence are doing enormous amounts of work for the long game that Marvel was playing toward Infinity War and Endgame. At the time of Age of Ultron's release, the full implications of those references weren't entirely clear. Some of them required watching several more films to fully understand. But they were all precisely placed, all meaningful, all part of a plan that was years in the making. The Mind Stone, embedded in Vision's forehead by the film's end, becomes one of the most important objects in the entire MCU, and Age of Ultron handles its introduction with appropriate gravity, while still keeping it comprehensible to audiences who hadn't been tracking the Infinity Stone storyline in detail. Now, I realize we've been spending a lot of time on the kind of bigger thematic and technical elements, so let me bring it back down to earth for a second and just talk about some of my personally favorite smaller moments in the film. Because sometimes it's the little things that make a movie truly great, and Age of Ultron has a bunch of those. The moment where Thor casually introduces himself to Laura Barton, Hawkeye's wife, as Thor, in the most matter-of-fact way possible, because of course that's just his name, and she treats it with exactly the same normalcy because she's apparently used to her husband bringing genuinely extraordinary beings into her home. It's a tiny moment, and it's completely hilarious. The ongoing bit where Tony keeps trying to get people to say language after Steve mildly criticizes him for swearing, which goes from a throwaway joke in the opening sequence to a recurring gag that pays off in increasingly absurd ways throughout the film. It's the kind of running joke that works because it reveals something true about both characters. Steve's instinctive commitment to certain standards, even in completely inappropriate contexts, and Tony's genuinely childlike delight in finding something that gets under Steve's skin. The moment where Steve and Tony are chopping wood at the farm and having what appears to be a perfectly casual conversation that is actually entirely about their fundamental philosophical disagreement about power and trust and responsibility. A conversation that contains the entire argument of civil war in miniature, conducted over firewood with complete civility. It's a masterfully written scene that tells you everything about where these two characters are heading without anyone raising their voice or being unkind. Bruce Banner's face when someone suggests something that he immediately recognizes as a terrible idea. That specific expression of exhausted, resigned, already calculating the probable disaster look that Mark Ruffalo has made completely his own. There are at least 3 separate moments in Age of Ultron where Bruce makes this face, and each one is a tiny masterclass in physical acting.
The bit where Ultron, in his first fully formed body, makes his entrance during the party scene, and his very first words are a kind of philosophical pronouncement about humanity and strings and freedom, delivered with James Spader's full theatrical commitment. And there's this beat where you can see every single Avenger processing the situation and coming to the same conclusion. Oh no. Before anything has technically gone wrong yet. It's a wonderful piece of ensemble reaction work. And, of course, the scene where Vision, asked about his worthiness, simply picks up Mjolnir and hands it to Thor as if it's just the obvious thing to do in this situation, because he needed it and it was right there, and then calmly sits down. The room's silence, Thor's expression, the film just moving on. Chef's kiss. Every time. These smaller moments are what separate a good blockbuster from a great one. You can have all the spectacle in the world. You can have incredible visual effects and perfectly choreographed action sequences, and those things matter. They genuinely do. But what makes an audience actually love a film, rather than just admire it, is these smaller, human moments. The moments where you laugh unexpectedly, or feel unexpectedly moved, or recognize something true about a character that you hadn't quite articulated to yourself before. Age of Ultron is full of those moments, and they're part of why the film has such staying power. Let me also spend a brief moment on what Age of Ultron tells us about friendship, because I think this is actually one of its most underrated qualities. The relationships between these characters feel genuinely warm and specific in ways that a lot of ensemble films don't quite manage. Tony and Bruce have the friendship of two people who are the only ones who fully understand each other's specific kind of genius, and there's a joy in their scientific collaboration that feels completely authentic. Steve and Natasha have the friendship of two people who have seen each other at their absolute worst and decided to trust each other anyway. There's a solidity to their dynamic that's different from its romantic charge in some other interpretations of these characters, and it works beautifully. Thor and Tony have this wonderful dynamic of two enormous personalities who genuinely respect each other while also finding each other mildly exasperating, which is the most relatable friendship dynamic in the entire film. And Hawkeye and Natasha. There's a history there that the film gestures toward without ever fully explaining, and the restraint of that choice is admirable. You don't need to know every detail of what they've been through together. You can see it in how they talk to each other, how they move around each other, the ease and the depth of their shorthand. Some friendships are so well established that they don't need explanation. They just need to be shown, and the audience will understand. Age of Ultron trusts its audience in exactly this way, and that trust is one of its most attractive qualities as a film. Now, if you're the kind of viewer who likes to keep track of continuity and connections across the MCU, and honestly, given that you've watched this entire video, I'm going to guess you probably are. There's a fun game you can play while re-watching Age of Ultron, which is spotting all the moments that become significantly more meaningful in retrospect. Some of these we've mentioned: the Sokovia Accords setup, the Wakanda references, the Infinity Stone threads. But there are others that are a bit more subtle. The way Wanda is visually positioned in group shots toward the end of the film, slightly apart from the main group, watching rather than fully participating, foreshadows so much of her subsequent journey. She's an Avenger now, but she's not entirely sure she belongs. And you can see that uncertainty in how Elizabeth Olsen holds herself in these ensemble frames. Vision's philosophical musings in his early scenes, contain ideas that will become absolutely central to WandaVision and Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness years later. The specific nature of Natasha's relationship with Bruce, two people who feel permanently outside of normal human experience, sets up the emotional logic of choices that both characters make in subsequent films. And Steve's near lifting of Mjolnir pays off in a way that, honestly, still makes audiences lose their minds in a theater. The MCU's ability to plant these kinds of seeds and tend to them across multiple films and multiple years is something genuinely unprecedented in Hollywood history. Individual films had set up sequels before. That's been happening as long as there have been studios. But the degree of interconnection and the intentionality of the long-game storytelling that Marvel achieved across this era is genuinely remarkable. And Age of Ultron is one of the central nodes in that web, a film that connects backward to everything that came before it and forward to enormous amounts of what comes after, while also being a completely satisfying experience on its own terms. One thing I think is genuinely worth appreciating, and that tends to get lost in the broader conversation about the MCU as a franchise, is how much genuine creative risk Age of Ultron took. By 2015, Marvel had established a formula that was clearly working. The first Avengers film had made over $1.5 billion. The solo franchises were all performing well. The audience was loyal and enthusiastic. They could have made Age of Ultron as a safe, crowd-pleasing, relatively uncomplicated continuation of what was already working. And they chose not to. They chose to make a film about the heroes making a catastrophic mistake and then dealing with the consequences. They chose to explore vulnerability and fear and the limitations of good intentions. They chose to end with a lineup change that removed several of the most beloved characters from the team, rather than simply continuing the status quo. These were all genuine risks, taken in the service of making something more interesting and more emotionally honest than the safe version would have been. That takes courage, both creative courage and corporate courage, and it deserves acknowledgement. The other creative risk that Age of Ultron took, and this one generated the most discussion at the time, was making Tony Stark the architect of the film's central disaster. Tony is Iron Man. Iron Man is arguably the character around whom the entire MCU was built. Making him the person whose hubris unleashes the main threat is a bold choice that could have alienated the character's enormous fan base. Instead, it enriched the character enormously. It gave Tony genuine consequences for a personality trait that had always been both his defining quality and his greatest flaw. It made him more interesting, more human, more worth caring about. And it set up the arc that would carry him through Civil War and Infinity War, all the way to the extraordinary conclusion of his journey in Endgame. You can draw a direct line from Tony's decision to create Ultron to everything that follows, and that line is one of the most compelling character journeys in modern cinema. So here's where I want to land, because I think this is the most important thing to say about Age of Ultron, the thing that underlies everything else we've discussed. This is a film that takes superheroes seriously. Not in a grim, dark, joyless way. The humor we've talked about makes sure of that. But in the sense of genuinely engaging with the questions that naturally arise from the premise of people with extraordinary abilities operating in the real world. What is power for? What responsibility comes with it? What happens when the best intentions produce the worst outcomes? Can something genuinely good emerge from something created with wrong intentions? What does it mean to be worthy of the things you've been given? These are real questions. They're not just superhero questions. And the film's willingness to engage with them seriously, while also being tremendously fun and entertaining, is what puts it in the company of the very best genre films, the ones that use their genre conventions not just as entertainment delivery mechanisms, but as frameworks for exploring things that actually matter about human experience. And on that note, okay, for real this time, I promise, that is genuinely it for today. We have covered this film from every conceivable angle, and if you've made it here, you clearly either love Age of Ultron as much as I do, or you have truly impressive endurance. And either way, I have enormous respect for you. Drop a comment letting me know what your single favorite moment from the film is. Not the most impressive action sequence, not the most technically accomplished shot, but the moment that made you feel something. Because that's always the most interesting answer. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't, and I genuinely will catch you in the next one. Go watch Age of Ultron again tonight. You won't regret it.